Hi, everyone. I think I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Kelly Bourne, Director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and also an affiliate at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. So really glad to be here today hosting this conversation on bridging the cybersecurity data gap, which is really a conversation about improving knowledge about and reducing the harms from cyber attacks. I'm really glad to be joined by three great guests. We have Taylor Reynolds of MIT's Internet Policy Research Initiative. Taylor's research focuses on cybersecurity, cyber risk, and the future of data. And before joining MIT, Taylor was a senior economist at the OECD, where he led the organization's information economy unit. We're joined also by Klara Jordan, who is the Chief Public Policy Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute in Geneva. CPI is a nonprofit that focuses on reducing harms from cyber attacks. And before joining CPI, Klara worked in both the corporate and nonprofit sectors. On the corporate side in privacy and policy at FireEye and at BlackBerry, and on the nonprofit side as the executive director for the EU and Africa at the Global Cyber Alliance. We're joined also by Megan Stifel, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology, which is a Silicon Valley-based think tank that has been leading on ransomware for some time. She, before that, was at the Global Cyber Alliance, and prior to that was in government as the Director of International Cyber Policy at the National Security Council, and prior to that at the U.S. Department of Justice as Director for Cyber Policy in the National Security Division. So thank you all so much for joining today. Really glad to have you. Just a little bit of background before we turn it over to our panelists. I think as anyone joining this call probably knows, cyber attacks have very much been on the rise. According to Forbes, last year, businesses suffered 50% more cyber attack attempts per week than in prior years. And data suggests that there is an attack somewhere on the web every 39 seconds, ranging from denial of service and DDoS attacks to phishing and ransomware, malware, spyware, kind of everything in between. Looking just at ransomware, something like 40% of all businesses and organizations are reported to have been hit last year. And cybercrime was forecast to cost the world something like $6 trillion last year, rising to $10.5 trillion in 2025. And while we see that cyber attacks in general are rising, we have seen particularly hard hit have been the education and healthcare sectors, where attacks have been up something like 70 and 75%. Concerning, of course, for those of us who have kids in school. On the healthcare front, we've seen impacts like longer lengths of stays in hospital, delays in procedures and tests, poor health outcomes, and even increases in patient mortality. And then looking beyond those sectors, we see concerns about everything from electrical blackouts to tampering with our water supply systems, failure of military equipment, breaches of national security secrets, theft of sensitive data. So a lot of reasons to be concerned about these rises in cyber attacks. And today, what we want to talk about is the real lack of data on this topic, despite having just run off a lot of figures. All of these are estimates, in part because data is so poor here, which is in part because there's really no incentive for organizations to report attacks. And on the contrary, there are concerns that that could invite regulatory scrutiny, it could damage organizations' reputations, it could provide an advantage to competitors. So the reporting here is really sparse, which makes it really hard to make good policy and to target resources to the right places, or even to see what kinds of protections and remedies are working. So what can be done? We have finally seen some movement in the last year. In March, Congress passed a bill requiring critical infrastructure firms to alert the government when they're hacked. So this would include finance, energy, and the healthcare sectors. This is the most expansive cyber reporting requirement that government has ever placed on industry. But when you talk to colleagues in charge of implementing this at CISA, for example, at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I think there are concerns that this could take up to 3 or 4 years to implement. We also see the SEC proposing new rules. So a lot to cover here about why this is important and what is being done. I'm going to start with Megan at the Institute for Security and Technology, because IST, Megan, you all stood up one of the most successful cybersecurity task forces in recent memory, the Ransomware Task Force, which brought together more than 60 experts from everywhere from Microsoft and Palo Alto Networks and Rapid7 to the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and Europol. So Megan, I'd love to start with you just to walk through the scope of the challenge here, some of the highlights from the ransomware task force recommendations, and then also to get your sense on how the US government is responding and any of the challenges that you see to a government-based policy approach. Because then I'd like to turn to Taylor. And Taylor, you all have created SCRAM, the Secure Cyber Risk Aggregation and Measurement Platform that takes a different approach from policy and relies basically on voluntary companies to voluntarily provide data about attacks. So would love to hear more about how that approach is working. And then Klara, would love finally to turn to you, and the Cyber Peace Institute has been doing some really remarkable work on tracking attacks on nonprofits and in particular the healthcare sector. And so would love to hear more about how you're aggregating that data and what you're learning about from that. So we'll turn to each of you in that order. I'll note that we'll try and save about 20 or 30 minutes for questions at the end from the audience. So folks in the audience can go ahead and just put questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to moderate those. But really, thank you all so much for being here. And Megan, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be with you and my former colleague, Klara, and a co-partner, if I may say, in at least the cyber initiative, Taylor, who's also been, I think, a part of this from the very early days. So thanks to Hewlett, especially for your support over the years. So Kelly mentioned a number of some of the kind of shocking statistics that have really caught headlines. One of the ones that really became a catalyst for some of the legislative measures that Kelly alluded to was an attack on Colonial Pipeline last May. As she also mentioned, I was honored to be a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, and Kelly also gave some of the details of that. But we were pleased and surprised, if I can say, to have had such a broad level of participation and such a level of commitment to outcomes that could be meaningful, not only for government, but also for industry and civil society in trying to manage this risk. I highlight the Colonial incident because we actually launched the task force effort, at the very last few days of 2020. The reason we did so is also based on some of the facts that Kelly alluded to, but really the scale and scope, watching the scale and scope of ransomware climb exorbitantly, all of those E's, over the beginning of the pandemic. And there are a number of reasons for that, some of which include the transition to work from home and kind of among other things, the poor hygiene that we see across the ecosystem, and thereby allowing criminals to exploit not only poor enterprise hygiene, but also for consumer hygiene. So if folks are working from home laptops, not business ones, they may not have the benefits in the early days of all those different capabilities that can be brought to bear. So we watched as 2020 unfolded to see hospitals, cities, schools attacked, and determined that this escalating risk posed a significant threat to national security, not the United States alone, but it was one of the primary targets at that time. Brought together this group of individuals and ultimately published a report last April. A few days after the report happened, the Colonial Pipeline incident happened. And the reason I raise Colonial in particular is I think it was really a catalyst, we think, looking back across all manner of cyber incidents, but particularly ransomware, in bringing attention to this issue. So if we think about what is the privacy, you kind of think ransomware, well, what's the privacy connection there? Ransomware is a symptom of a broader problem, and that broader problem can result in compromise of information that is private information, and the ongoing reluctance to share information about incidents, whether they are ransomware incidents, data breaches, business email compromise, all manner of cybersecurity incidents, continues to pose a risk to not only individual privacy, but also the privacy of enterprises, trade secrets, all of those things that, all of those investments, if you will, that companies and individuals want to keep to themselves. And one of the things that among the outcomes that we noted in the Ransomware Task Force report was that there needed to be a higher emphasis placed on the ability to obtain information for the reasons that Kelly alluded to, but in particular thinking about how governments, not only the United States, can best identify tools and capabilities to manage the risk is significantly hindered when they are operating in a vacuum or in a insufficient information environment. I think ransomware is also a useful example because we think about ransomware exploits a computer vulnerability. There's one set of information related there. It requires a payment. There's a separate financial element there, so another data set that also involves privacy implications. And those payments are often delivered in cryptocurrencies. But in order to, so there's a third set of information there. In order to convert, so cryptocurrency is not still something that is that dominant, it's increasing, but in order for individuals to obtain cryptocurrencies to make these payments, they are usually using a financial institution. Again, there are privacy requirements around, at this point, the disclosure by financial institutions of certain types of data that may be relevant to a cyber incident. And they are a good, one might say they're a choke point. They may not like that description, but they are a key tool and a key information source in this information environment. But there are also others, as I mentioned, the victims in this case, as well as the infrastructure provider, so the cloud provider upon whom either the criminals or the victim is relying to store their data, whether it's for licit or illicit purposes. They also have access to a tremendous amount of information, which can include cybersecurity information, things that under US law are types of information under US law that can be identified as cyber threat indicators. What does that mean? Largely, it means metadata. Things like IP addresses, could be a hash, so a unique signature to a particular type of exploit. It could be the type of operating system potentially, but largely non-content information. So not the email that I might send to Kelly asking her for advice about an upcoming trip I'm taking, which I actually did. Under US law, the government has also identified defensive measures as cybersecurity information, and it affords this type of information a degree of protection for the sharing between entities of this type of data. And I raise that because it took, in addition to the reporting legislation, which I'll quickly come on to, and I'm keeping track of my time, it took a long time for us in the government, for the US government, to decide that there needed to be extra incentives to get individuals to share information. So the approach of, well, if we can facilitate information sharing, that will help us reduce our cybersecurity risk, was one that was well in the minds of government for a number of years, dating back to the 90s. In 2011, at that time, Obama administration put together a number of legislative proposals that included information sharing and included reporting, but only one of those was successful, and it took almost 6 years for it to be successful, and this was the Information Sharing Act, which, among other things, again, affords liability protection for sharing information between industry partners, but also from industry to the government. What we see as a result, including through the ransomware incidents, is that was insufficient. So the incentives probably were not great enough, because if they had been, hopefully we would not be seeing the huge scourge of ransomware that we've seen over the past few years. So fast forward through beginning in 2015, this legislation that I referred to, the Cybersecurity and Information Security Sharing Act, I think I have its name right. Experts begin to think, well, the incentives should be there. People should start sharing more information will flow to the government. We should have a better sense of things. The reality is, as Kelly articulated, we don't. Hence, in the report, among other things, we said that there also needs to be a requirement to report, not just a benefit through liability protection for sharing, but actually a requirement to share. I would say, for the purposes of IST, I think we were a bit disappointed that the scope of that reporting requirement was narrowed down to critical infrastructure. Following our report last spring, this ransomware task force report, and I can drop it in the chat, we noted that we really did think that it would be important not only for critical infrastructure providers, but also for small businesses to share information, noting also that places a significant burden on small businesses because by themselves they have limited ability to manage the risks that they currently confront. So putting another burden on them in terms of reporting information further complicates things for them. In the end, I think the passage of the Reporting Act that Kelly mentioned is a positive step forward. And hopefully through the rulemaking process that Kelly alluded to, we will begin to obtain and support the government in getting better information. I think it will also be an opportunity for the government to share and kind of further articulate its ability to protect the privacy of information that's shared with it, and the victims who are sharing information. I think there's an opportunity for the government to be a bit more transparent through its work over the past 6 to 7 years in its ability to protect information shared under the Information Sharing Act, and bring that learning forward. At the same time, though, through the reporting requirement, there's also an opportunity for the government to push more information out to better equip both industry as well as civil society and others in protecting themselves from cybersecurity risks. And again, sort of circling back to the privacy point here, the opportunity to share information in a protected manner or in an anonymized fashion, thinking about the way anonymized and then anonymizing the information itself and being able to think and compare it in a less privacy invasive way through some of the work that Taylor's been undertaking, is beneficial for all of us. And so we really don't have more time to wait in thinking about how to share information. We are already witnessing significant impacts on critical infrastructure in the United States. You can look at Costa Rica and Peru and what's happened to those governments over the past few weeks to think about the fact that this is not just a US problem. So the time is now to really think holistically about not only sharing of information, but how we can do so in a manner that protects privacy and in a manner that's sufficient enough and quick enough to get information into the hands of those who need it most. So I've shared the report from last spring. We also produced a report that we shared last week, kind of checking on what progress has been made. And unfortunately, we noted last week that from 2020 to 2021, the number of ransomware attacks increased by 82%. Payments were up 70%. So again, thinking about the need to share this information related to these types of incidents is quite high. And so I was pleased to hear further this spring about the work that Taylor's been doing in particular in helping organizations find new ways to share information. So I think maybe after this, I'll turn it over to him, Kelly, unless there's an intervention you'd like.
No, that's perfect, Megan. Thank you so much. And yeah, Taylor, would love to just hear more from you. It's been fascinating to follow SCRAM's development, the Secure Cyber Risk Aggregation and Measurement System, and would love to just hear more about how you're working with the private sector and what you're learning from that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this. It's great. I do have some slides, and you should be able to see them. I should be down in the little corner there. So my name is Taylor Reynolds. I work at MIT in the Internet Policy Research Initiative. And we have a team of researchers, a cross-disciplinary team that's working on trying to solve this cybersecurity data gap. So we've got cybersecurity experts, we've got risk experts, we have cryptographers, and we come together to try and figure out if there's a way to kind of address this long-standing problem. So in the course of, I'm just going to take a few minutes here. The key takeaways, what I'd like you to walk away from my presentation thinking is, number one, kind of understanding that there are these new cryptographic tools that allow us to do data aggregation and data analytics over encrypted data that never gets disclosed. So it's like working with private data. MIT, the second thing is that MIT has used one of these cryptographic tools to develop a platform that allows us to pull in cybersecurity data and try and address this gap. And then the third thing, because I know this is a diverse group, I think that these technologies have really broad applications outside of cybersecurity, in healthcare, in retail, and data governance. So hopefully in the stuff that I say, light bulbs will go off in your head about ways that you might be able to use these types of tools in your own research. So let me just jump back about a year ago to a White House memo that came out in June 2021. Now, this was addressed to corporate executives and business leaders from the White House, and I think it's the first time something like this has been done. And when it landed, the CEOs looked at this and it said, we have a problem with ransomware, and these are the steps that we think companies should take to defend themselves against ransomware. Well, this immediately started a chain of events where it moves down to the security teams, who then scrambled to be able to respond to their CEOs and say, this is what we're doing, this is how we've addressed these issues that the White House has said, and these are the things we need to do. But what was missing was the ability to really put that in context relative to their peers. So one of the key pieces of data that we're missing is the level of readiness or the defense posture of all of these firms across the US. The other thing we don't know is where we have gaps, like where are we defending well and where are we not defending well? And thirdly, we don't have a way to track progress over time. So White House sends this out. How do we know if we've made progress into next year? So the reason for this, as Kelly mentioned very well, is that firms hesitate to share information for a number of reasons, like regulatory scrutiny and legal liability. But that leaves us in a state where organizations don't know how to prioritize their own cybersecurity investments. So where do we put the scarce resources that we have in order to defend ourselves better? How do we get the best ROI? Insurance providers also don't have this data. So they're missing this data. And how do they react? Well, they boost up premiums and they lower the limits and aggregates, or essentially the coverage that they offer. And then the attackers are the other group that's kind of affected by this. They benefit. Like, this benefits them, because if we don't talk about how we were vulnerable and attacked, if we don't tell our neighbor's going to get attacked in the very same way. And that is exactly what's happening. We see the attackers go within a sector to firm, to firm, to firm, to firm, because they're not sharing data. So that's a lot of bad news, but let me tell you the good news. I am really excited about some of the tools, the new computational tools that are being developed that allow us to skirt around this problem with sharing sensitive data. So I'm going to talk quickly about one called multi-party computation, which is the one that we use for SCRAM. So essentially, let me just step you quickly through one slide of how this works, and I think it will make sense. So the first thing we do is we have the firms lock up their data. So they take their sensitive data. This is a hospital, for example, would lock up their data, encrypt it, and then they would send that encrypted piece of data over to us. And we don't have the key. It's only the firm. They maintain their own key. We gather up all of those encrypted pieces, and the magic of multi-party computation is that we can actually do math over the top of these encrypted blobs. So we can sum them all up and we get the result, which is also an encrypted piece of data that we cannot read. So in the third step, what we do is we ask each of the participants to use their key to help us unlock just the answer of this computation. And what we end up with is an aggregate of what has happened across the group without ever seeing what happened to the individuals who submitted their data. So we built this into a platform that we call SCRAM. And what we essentially do on the SCRAM platform is we bring peer groups together. So we'll organize a group of pharmaceutical companies to come together and share their data. And then we aggregate their data without requiring them to disclose any of it. And then we run the computation and we share back benchmarks, which show how they're comparing relative to their peers, and parameters for modeling risk. So the benchmarks look like this on the left. It's essentially what percentage of firms have adopted which security controls or security defenses. And then we're filling in this gap in risk, which is when you calculate risk, you need the frequency that something happens and you need the loss that results from that event. And what we're doing is we're filling in those two pieces. So let me show you, let me get to some of the really interesting data. So I find this just fascinating. We ran this computation with some very large firms. And what this shows is across the x-axis on the bottom, these are all the different things you can be doing to defend your network. And then the y-axis with the blue lines is the losses that the firms have seen, like actual losses they've seen from failures of those controls. So if I'm a security person and I look at this chart, I immediately look over to the left and I say, wow, those are the things that I need to be focused on because that's where the losses are. So I've got 171 things I need to be doing, but actually those top 20 are really where where people are losing money. So I think I'm going to focus on those first. So that's what the losses look like. We also give data on frequency of failure. And I found this really interesting. The category where you see the failures the most often in the CIS structure is called number 17, which is implement a security awareness and training program. And essentially what that is people clicking on phishing links. Like that's what happens the most, is people click on those. The second most problematic area is boundary defenses. And then finally, we offer this adoption that lets you see the percentage of firms in your peer group that adopt a certain control to see if maybe you're behind or ahead of the others in your group. Let me just quickly jump back and tell you a little more detail about our ransomware computation that's going on right now. So we thought that the memo that came from the White House was really good, and we converted all of those recommendations into a set of 22 steps that firms can take to defend their networks. And we called it a ransomware readiness index, and it's pulled exactly from the White House's guidance. And then what we did is we reached out to critical infrastructure providers across the US, and we're doing this with municipalities that run critical infrastructure like water systems, like electricity grids. And that is an ongoing computation that we're doing now, and it's going to finish at the end of this month. So we should have new data on how municipalities are defending their networks in the next month or two. So we're very excited. And what we're trying to do is answer those three questions. What's the level of readiness? Where are the gaps? And how can we track progress over time? This is what it looks like when they fill in their data. It's a simple Excel spreadsheet that gets encrypted. So you can see it's fairly easy to kind of navigate and get through. And all they have to do is fill out the Excel spreadsheet and load it onto the platform. We have a number of active research partnerships I'll just quickly talk about. We have one, kind of our big project is with the Federal Reserve Bank right now. We're working on developing cyber risk measurements with the Federal Reserve and with the largest banks in the United States to figure out what are the things that we need to be tracking that then could be shared and compared across firms. We're also working with the 300 municipalities. We do computations with large sectors, with firms in a sector. And then we're working with insurance providers to try and understand what control failures are leading to the losses that they eventually pay out. So my final slide is just summary of our contribution to what we're trying to do here is the SCRAM platform that can run these secure multi-party computations. We're doing research to find out when it's safe to run a computation and when it isn't. I was surprised, but we're doing a lot of community building, like to bring the groups together to actually share data. We spend a lot of time on that. We're working on standardization to make sure that the data that comes in is similar and normalized. And then we're producing these new benchmarks and risk data that we're hoping is going to help the industry. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Kelly.
Taylor, thanks so much. And that's just totally fascinating to see the data on how concentrated the areas are where people are losing the most money. Klara, would love to turn it over to you now. I know that the Cyber Peace Institute has been collecting data, in your case, on the healthcare sector and on cyber attacks against the healthcare sector. And I know also you've been tracking Ukraine, which has been fascinating to watch. Would love to just hear more about it. And my understanding is that you're tracking, not just the number of attacks, of which I think you've seen something like more than 400 against the healthcare sector since you started tracking this a couple of years ago, but also trying to assess the impact and the harm caused by these attacks. So would love to hear more about how you're collecting that data and what you're learning.
Thank you, Kelly. As you mentioned, Kelly, about 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, the Cyber Peace Institute started to focus on the healthcare sector because we thought that it's particularly important that we highlight the amount of cyber attacks and their negative impacts that were happening during the pandemic. We thought it was particularly egregious to do something like that at a time when the sector needed the most. This really goes into this need to bring resilience, diplomacy, and accountability sort of together to protect the healthcare sector. So the Institute started to focus on this, and we started to collect these incidents about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And as we started to do that, we actually realized that there are pretty significant gaps, to which I will go to in a couple of minutes. But what we're really trying to do is we are tracking globally cyber incidents and cyber attacks on the healthcare sector, so we can really get a good snapshot of what is going on globally, and then in particular countries, because we have a platform that tracks these cyber attacks. And we consider this global sort of understanding of where the attacks on cyber and healthcare sector are because there are still a lot of countries that lack the awareness that the healthcare sector is particularly vulnerable. There are still countries who think that, well, this would not happen to us. There's still countries or governments, they would say, well, why would someone attack hospitals? So we think it's really important sort of for this global awareness to track this. Now, as you mentioned, we're not only tracking that the incident happened, we are really trying to look at the operational disruption that resulted out of this incident. And we're really trying to think, okay, how would the operational disruption relate to the harm caused to individuals? We think harm is such a sort of crucial concept in understanding the impact of cyber attacks. If we understand harm and we understand where the most impact can happen, it can both inform the resilience measures, and both Megan and Taylor did mention, we need to know what is happening so we know where to focus our efforts. And in the Institute's perspective, it is the area that can cause most harm. It's the part of the sector where it can have most impact on individuals we should prioritize. But we also think that understanding the harm and impact is a very powerful metrics. So then the policymakers can prioritize the accountability for cyber attacks. So we should sort of hold the malicious actors accountable as a matter of principle, but, the more impact, the more harm, the more, let's say, active we should be in pursuing those who are causing these cyber attacks. So just a couple of, just really a couple of things that I want to highlight in this. So a couple of things we've seen as big trends that I want to mention here is that basically the healthcare sector has been attacked globally, but it has been attacked the most in the past 18 months in the United States. Now, we have our own data challenges, as I mentioned, but we think that, in the United States, there is sort of the best coverage of these cyber attacks. There are some efforts, to increase the reporting. So we are sort of seeing that, okay, we can glean some more insights into what is happening to the sector. But over the past 6 months, sort of from January, we're not in the summer, I guess, wishful thinking. So over the past 4 months, I would say, we've really seen attacks in Europe sort of going up. Now, it's very hard for the analysts to really explain and understand the correlation between the numbers, but we're making some assumptions that there is an increased attention to the issue of ransomware in the United States, whereas in Europe and in some of the countries around the world, this is still lacking in terms of awareness. So that is one thing we've noticed. We've also noticed a very sort of pernicious trends when it comes to ransomware attacks on the healthcare sector. And, they go now to sort of double, triple, and quadruple extortion, which means not only the data is being held for ransom, the data is then being, extracted and leaked and sold. And now we've also seen some attacks where the individual victim, so not only the hospital, but the individual whose data being accessed is being held for ransom. So really this evolving trend is very, very dangerous because there is this potential for re-victimization of the individual. Once your information has been out there, it's out there perhaps, for the entirety of your life. So very sensitive information about your mental health issues, learning challenges and other problems, which can really impacts individual life for his or her lifetime. It's becoming really sort of personal, these cyber attacks. So this is a second observation I wanted to share. And the third observation we've sort of seen through the data is that there's a group of ransomware operators that specialize in attacking healthcare. And it's just awful to even say, someone is making this specialty. And what we find also very interesting and sort of alarming is that many of these ransomware actors would say, okay, we will not attack healthcare, or we will stay away from attacking vulnerable populations, but the data says otherwise. So again, this is a trend where the criminal actors and this whole ecosystem of ransomware service is really operating in an environment where they really don't respect any of the restrictions, and then they don't even abide sort of by their own promises. So some of the interesting things the data was also telling us is sort of the scale and scope. I will just mention some of our findings, and the findings are based on the data we could collect, and that is going to be my last point. But as you mentioned, the institute looked at about 400 incidents globally over the past 18 months. And for example, the data is telling us that the average operational disruption to a service lasted from a matter of hours to 4 months, averaging 19.3 days per incident. So this is the data we could obtain from open source information, from media reporting. And if we think about that, an average operational disruption is almost 20 days per incident. This is a very serious ability of the healthcare sector of the organization to provide a critical care. The other thing, we've looked at the data breaches, and I think we've heard so much about data breaches that there's slightly less coverage, but we're seeing now again this re-victimization, out of data breaches, and Megan did talk about, sort of the privacy aspect. So, the data breaches really went up. We've seen about, 3 million sort of records being breached and stolen over the period of time. And on average, it's 150,000 records per incident. So again, it's a lot of data per incident. And again, we are seeing many more things happening with the data once there was the breach, once the data was extracted. It is this quadruple extortion. It is this contacting the victim. It is a resale of data. And again, from the institute's concern is this re-victimization and how this data can be used against someone over and over and over and again. Another statistics that is alarming is that almost 60% of incidents out of this group of 400 systems went offline. So there were sort of several disruption to the ability of an organization to access their systems. And in all of these accidents, in 73%, the data was leaked or exposed. So this really gets to that human side, the privacy, and the potential for re-victimization. We've also seen in these incidents, again, it's a sample of 400, that there's diversions of ambulances are happening in about 15% of incidents, and there's we're on an upward trend of cancellation of appointments in about 21% of incidents. So again, these numbers tell us what is on average happening in these after these cyber attacks, and what is the operational disruption. Now, we are figuring out as an organization with a community sort of this correlation between disruption and harm. And the Institute has built a methodology for measuring this harm. And it's a fairly complicated exercise. We've reached out to many different communities who've built these different sort of indicators, indexes, and measurements, and we are refining it. But we've heard from several policymakers that they are very keen on working with this because it helps them do several things. It helps them to work internally and sort of dedicate resources, attention to where the most harm can happen. We know from the diplomatic community we engage with regularly here in Geneva that they want to sometimes take a stance as a country sort of internationally against these cyber attacks on the healthcare sector, but they have to do some internal advocacy even with their own government, because that particular government may have not been, or that particular country may have not been hit by these cyber attacks, but they just believe that as a matter of principle, healthcare should be off limits. So it helps to do these diplomatic efforts, and then it helps these accountability initiatives when we sort of see what is the human impact. Just to wrap on sort of the data challenges, it's been mentioned by previous speakers that sort of it's very challenging to have that reporting, to have that understanding what is happening for so many different reasons. And so, for example, our analysts, they spend quite a lot of time using the open source information. They go to different ISACs or different groupings that are focusing on the healthcare sector data. They go directly to NHS or HHS or other organizations that may have these reports. But unfortunately, sometimes they have to go to look at some of the dump sites or some of the darker sides of the internet, to the leak forums and all that. And we would not count the incident unless we have double check or we had a ways to verify, that cyber attack happened. But this just shows that sometimes we learn about an incident from a dump site. Sometimes we learn about an incident from a malicious actor. And we think this is it's a huge gap, and it's a perverse thing we have to do to go learn from malicious cyber actor that a cyber attack on a hospital happened. So we think that really that reporting is key to, as I mentioned, resilience, accountability, but really to get to the point where we can work on understanding the harm and cyber attack and impact of cyber attacks beyond the financial harm, beyond that the disruption happened, or beyond sort of numbers, to be able to really talk in more human terms, the human cost of it in a sector that is, particularly human when the harm is particularly human. For us, it's really needed to change a bit of the narrative and focus action. Thank you.
Klara, thank you so much. I really appreciate you humanizing this and the talk about the 15% of ambulances being diverted, or, people essentially being blackmailed. I mean, it really brings home the impact of these attacks. I want to now go ahead and open it up for questions. We have a number in the chat, and so I will start there. But if others on the line have questions, please go ahead and enter those now. I wanted to start with something that Megan, you brought up, the recent attacks on Costa Rica and Peru. For those who haven't been following, in the last month or so, Costa Rica was hit, and their government ended up declaring a state of emergency when their data was government agency data was accessed. Peru, I believe the National Directorate of the Intelligence was hit as well. Curious what you all know about the state of reporting in other countries. Klara, you mentioned that the US is actually ahead of the game, which is hard to believe sitting here that this is what ahead of the game looks like, and thinking about policy in this domain. But we got a question also from the audience about, multi-stakeholder opportunities to sort of collaborate across borders. So would love to get a sense of the international landscape here.
Sure, and I'll offer a few thoughts, but I think others should as well. So we had an event last week, and we were fortunate to have a participant from NCSC, the UK's equivalent of CISA, who mentioned that they too are struggling with this reporting and kind of the information gap. And so while it is a bit surprising to think that the US is ahead of the game, which I would argue that we're behind the game, we're just less far behind than some others. This question of incentives, which is really kind of the heart of the reporting requirement question, is, I think, not unique to the United States. I don't think it's actually unique to democracy here. It just may be the case that authoritarian regimes have other ways to get information. So I think it's one that we all need to work. I think the idea of thinking about multi-stakeholder approaches is important. However, the multi-stakeholder system isn't able to offer the liability protection that I think we need for some actors to be able to feel comfortable sharing this information. We haven't yet succeeded in convincing particularly for-profit entities that thinking about cybersecurity as an essential governance mechanism and one that actually benefits their bottom line. We haven't yet been successful in convincing them of such or as such, and therefore we'll need those other types of incentives, I think, to really move the reporting needle forward. So thereby basically saying that what's a challenge for the United States, I think, is largely a challenge for the global ecosystem and the global internet. Unfortunately, or fortunately, much of the ecosystem is still, but there's a large percentage of US entities that are supporting the infrastructure itself. which makes them kind of a market mover. We have those seen, I think, if you think about GDPR in particular, and I think we're on the 4-year anniversary today, that, from a less large region, I guess it's fair to say, but Klara and others will correct me, that was actually an effective regulatory measure to move a global market. And so I don't think we should necessarily sit behind and wait for the United States to move the needle. I think there are a number of aspects of the United States legislative process that may be different elsewhere. And so there's an opportunity, I think, again, for leadership from Europe on this issue as well. So turn it to someone else.
Megan, thanks. Klara, Taylor, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I would just very briefly add something on a sort of the multi-stakeholder and multilateral processes, sort of with the big M, the sort of the UN fora. I mean, these topics come out, and obviously anyone who's ever touched anything that involves all the member states of the United Nations, plus in a current geopolitical sort of environment, is very difficult. But I think what is important is that it does create awareness of the problem, and what it then does is that it allows some countries to reach out to each other with this desire to collaborate bilaterally on these topics. So I just wanted to offer something. So, the UN process is moving very slowly, but we're now hearing that, 75% countries, when they talk about, when they're doing their interventions, they do talk about ransomware. They're talking about the healthcare sector. They're talking about understanding the threat. It is the first question in this current open-ended working group, which is a process where all the UN member states can participate in dealing with and better understanding these non-responsible state behavior. The first question is, what is the threat landscape the state should be focusing on? And many states are now saying, we need to do more reporting. We need to do more understanding of the threat landscape, and that goes, that goes through better mechanisms to report, share, understand, and collaborate with partners.
Klara, thank you for that. And on the point, Taylor, something you want to add there?
I just wanted to say something on the incentives to riff off of what Megan was saying. When we're running our computations with the municipalities, one of the insurance pools of the municipalities that we work with offered the members like a $50 discount on their insurance premiums if they filled out our questionnaire for SCRAM. And you think, my initial reaction to that was, well, $50 isn't going to mean very much for these cities and towns, but actually it's been a huge driver. Like this $50, because the town manager comes in and says, I want the discount. And so the IT department puts it together. So I think the incentives really can work, and we'd be surprised at how powerful they are.
Taylor, thank you for that. I wanted to now turn to a question sort of building off of, how are we thinking about the categories of risk here? Someone had asked if we could see, Taylor, your slide again on which attacks are causing the most damage. And I think, Taylor, you'd also wanted to address it. It looked like another question just about understanding, privacy versus anonymous or second order, what is this first or second order question here?
Yeah, that was actually my bad. I meant to answer it in an answer and I clicked the wrong button, but I put the slide back up here so you can see the biggest losses came from central log management. So something about not detecting what was happening very early. We had denied communications over unauthorized ports. We had maintained detailed asset inventory. We have managed anti-malware software, kind of alert on suspicious login behavior, deploy a SIM, and have penetration tests. So those are the kind of big top loss leaders for our thing.
Thank you for that. And did you want to add anything on the privacy question here and whether that is second order?
So I don't think I've got, let me just find, how effective are I can't see it. I can't see the question in here anymore. I'm sorry. That's my bad.
No, it's no problem. I'll read it back to you really quickly. It was just a question about whether privacy versus anonymity is a second order question because it only becomes valid when organizations are motivated to act on the threat. And so just how are you thinking about the importance of privacy here with this data?
So one of the things that I really love about the way our platform works is that we actually, it's an opportunity to actually work perfectly with encrypted data so that you never have to store unencrypted data that becomes a privacy leak. So as we were kind of doing this, a lot of people said, well, you know, what happens if your data gets compromised? And we said, well, we don't have a key to this. I actually think that these types of analyses, we do a lot of work on privacy enhancing technologies, and these types of technologies are actually better than anonymization in terms of privacy protections because you're not losing some of the explanatory power of the data by anonymizing it. You actually get to use it all. But one of the things that we've learned is that you have to put guardrails in place or else you'll leak information that would be a privacy problem.
Great. Thank you, Taylor, for that. Megan, a question that I think maybe we want to direct towards you, which is one about paying the ransom or not. And would really welcome anyone's input here, but this question about whether that should be made illegal. We've heard interesting conversations. I've heard interesting conversations with CISA and others about this, but curious people's thoughts on whether or not to pay and whether or not to make that illegal.
Sure, it's a critical question. It's one just from the experience with the ransomware task force. It's one that was hotly debated among task force members, and we ultimately did not reach a consensus decision. What we instead noted, so just quickly, it is not illegal in the United States to pay a ransom. However, it is highly discouraged. And we find that discouraging policy stance in both, I think, Treasury, CISA, and DOJ guidance. The reason it's highly discouraged is because a couple of things. One, by making payments, you are encouraging more ransoms because they think they will make a payday, the bad actors. Two, you might not actually get your information back. Once the information is compromised, yes, there are promises made that copies have been destroyed. However, two things. One, you don't know that they've actually been destroyed, and who knows how good the OPSEC of these ransomware actors themselves is. So does that suggest perhaps that even if Conti, for example, destroyed the information, some other group might also have access to it? Three, you incentivize the possibility of being re-victimized. I think Klara touched on this a bit, but if it becomes known that, to borrow the phrase of a colleague, Flo's Flower Shop pays ransoms, then Flo's Flower Shop may be targeted again. We did say, though, in recognizing that we didn't reach consensus on the payment of ransoms, that setting kind of a target date for the legalization, if you will, of ransom payments could be something that might be valuable, but that it shouldn't happen in the very near future, because to borrow the phrase of one of our co-chairs, Jen Ellis, she said we're basically setting ourselves up to play a game of chicken with ransomware actors. They will push the line as far as they can to see if we actually mean what we say. But two, that really it's important to think about setting a pathway towards banning payments. And along that pathway should be some of the other recommendations from the task force report, like giving small businesses clear guidance on how they can reduce their ransomware risk, equipping them with resources, looking at equipping state and locals with additional funding, setting up a response and recovery fund to discourage companies and organizations from paying ransoms. A number of these have been actually, thankfully, part of legislation that's passed in the United States, even just recently, but actually getting those funds in the hands of some of these entities that need it the most has not yet occurred, and is still one that's outstanding for work. There's also been, I think, this question around the role of insurance providers, and were they paying ransom payments or were they just covering the losses? I think there's been a significant shift in the past year about kind of the way that that insurance providers are thinking about ransomware, and really recognizing that they can be an effective partner in reducing the risk by, among other things, requiring better security from their insureds. And I think, certainly Taylor's work and the work that Klara has been undertaking with others is one or several important pieces of the puzzle that we really need to work together further on in order to incentivize kind of this voluntary work where we're not waiting actually, to think about other incentive structures that might come from perhaps legislation, whether it be in the United States or elsewhere. So I would definitely discourage it. As one of my former DOJ friends and colleagues said, remember you're dealing with criminals. So they're probably not very trustworthy.
Thank you, Megan. Well put. Another question here about sort of where we are focused today, which is on collecting data after, a vulnerability has been detected and after an attack has taken place. And a question about what can be done sort of further up in the value chain to think about incentivizing companies to sort of software providers essentially to provide more secure products, and what's being done there to hold providers accountable. Anyone have thoughts on this? I'll stop there.
I mean, I'll mention two quick things. One is there has been really significant sort of resilience initiatives, or with cyber hygiene, and every country, almost every government has undertaken pretty significant campaigns. So there is some of it. Some organizations are providing tools, but sort of that awareness and resilience is happening. But then I would say in several countries, I can right now only think of UK, there are these efforts around secure by design and better standards and really better focus on how to build better and safer things. So sort of the consumer is not at the mercy of what was put into what they are using. But this is obviously a slow process. I mean, in the United States, the NTIA has been leading the efforts around the software bill of materials. So there's lots of efforts that are going to this, trying to reach this better resilience of the supply chain software, IoT devices and everything. But I think it's such a complicated and a complex ecosystem that this will take some time. But from my perspective, very positive steps have been taken to put some of the processes or framework in place. And I think the next step will be to see, what is voluntary, what is not voluntary, and where do we find the right balance between requiring organizations to do something. But I think that business model of building quicker or cheaper, or reusing without understanding what we're putting, what are the ingredients that go into the secret sauce. I think it's the slowly shifting trend. And a lot more work has to also go into sort of the awareness of consumers, even how we think about what we buy, what we consume, what do we expect, what are we willing to pay? Because I think these things sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting work being done there to try and improve consumer awareness. So I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to save time for each of you to share just any 30 seconds of parting thoughts on sort of priorities here. I also didn't want to miss the question about the Ukraine and Klara, you had mentioned attacks increasing in the last 4 months. Having followed your work on the Ukraine and having followed this closely in other areas as well, it's been surprising, I think, how little we've seen in the Ukraine compared to what was perhaps anticipated. So maybe you want to touch on that in your final few seconds, Klara, but from each of you, just any final remarks or thoughts on priorities here? Megan, you want to jump in?
I was going to give the floor to somebody else, but since I'm here, I will just quickly say, I think the Ukraine situation is one that deserves ongoing attention. It was, I think, helpful to the overall global discourse around what's happening there for Microsoft to put out its report a couple of weeks ago. I think they've shared some more information most recently, but I'm a little preoccupied. Also, the United States government recently gave publicly some greater detail on the amount of resources it's been putting in to support the infrastructure in Ukraine. And I think these are, important steps, but they also highlight a question or a number of questions, one of which is, can we scale this capability and capacity if we were to face, particularly if you think about what's happened in the United States in the last 24 hours, a conflict in a different region, however that may have been walked back. But really thinking about if this is what it takes to protect a critical democracy from an authoritarian regime, are we satisfied with this as a pathway forward on a regular basis? Is this sustainable? And I think the answer, in my opinion, ought to be no. So we need to demand more from everyone. And I think through the measures that Taylor and others have been undertaking, we can see that there is a pathway forward to sharing information in a more meaningful way, which should ultimately then, I think, hopefully go back, we can take the conversation back to not just kind of the incidents, but move further up the chain or backwards through the supply chain to say, right now, let's pay attention and let's offer some incentives to some of the, if we need to, I would argue we don't, but to manufacturers to think about how we're getting to market with these products still. Thank you again for having me.
Megan, thank you so much. Klara, Taylor, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll mention something on the Ukraine, if I just may. I know we are at the top of the hour, but Kelly, you asked the question, or that you mentioned that there's been less, perhaps, is what we would expect. And I think, I think there's been all kinds of sort of commentators who were expecting or predicting more destructive and visible sort of cyber offensive further to the military invasion. And I think there's been these explanations and theories, and I think they are very important because they have tested some of our existing assumptions about the potential impact of cyber operations during an armed conflict. And so, the fact that there hasn't been this, kinetic sort of big kinetic effect, I think it just reminded the world of two things. One is that when we have hostilities waged, brutally by conventional weapons, perhaps that resort to subterfuge, cyber operation, is not necessarily. But the other thing I will say that we've looked at the numbers, and really the truth about the harm and the impact, again, is in the numbers, because just looking at in a couple of in 2 months, we know that there's been 7-fold increase of cyber attacks, in comparison to the previous year. And there is destruction, there is disruption, and there is disinformation campaigns. And all of these are causing significant societal harm. And so, again, I think it's important to say, look, harm and attacks are happening, even if we don't get the big bang we've heard about for 10 years. I think it really is helping us to reconceptualize what harm means and how society can suffer by these other cyber attacks that we're seeing. And I think it does help then to sort of slice this big problem and say, look, this is how the disruption, destruction, disinformation happens, and what we have to do to increase the resilience.
Claire, thank you for that. Taylor, I know we're out of time, but any final thoughts from you? No? All right.
Look, I'm excited about the progress that's going on here. I'm excited to see so many smart people like Megan and Klara working on these issues. I think it's going to take some work, but we see the momentum building.
Likewise, really grateful to all of you for everything you're doing here and for taking the time today. So thank you really very much for joining us and for staying a couple of minutes late. I apologize. Wanted to share that we have a couple more webinars coming up, one on May 31st, one on June 7th, before taking a little bit of a break. So hope that folks will join us for those. And really just a huge thanks to everyone, to our panelists, and to everyone for joining us today. Thank you. And yeah, stay well. Take care.
Thank you.